Hi, this is Catherine, and this is Taking Tea with Catherine. This is Jasmine green tea. As you know, if you've been watching this channel for any amount of time, it's my favorite type of green tea. And I haven't had it in a while, so I'm kind of happy to have it now. Um, I am trying to incorporate more green tea in my life, but it's hard because I tend to, in the morning, drink a breakfast tea. And then I've been trying to cut down on my caffeine intake and my caffeine intake is yeah. But anyway, today's a good day because I was able to have jasmine green tea. All right, have I spoken enough about that? It's from Upton, by the way, which is a really good company that I order from every once in a while. And I decided, I've not been doing too many proper monthly wrap ups because my reading pace has just been slower. Also, because as I mentioned in my last video, I've been reading a lot of books at once, which doesn't mean that my reading pace is always slower. It's just that when you read that much, you don't always finish as much in one given month. But I do have 4 books that I want to talk about, and I thought I'd make it my first spring wrap up. I don't know. That might work, right? And so it's a good, in my opinion, mix of books. I have 2 fiction and 2 nonfiction, and we're starting off with always a favorite, Anthony Trollope, and that is He Knew He Was Right, and it's a pretty big-ish one. He's written a lot of big books, but this is a good book. I will say it's not my favorite of Anthony Trollope's books. I'm calling it the Emma of Anthony Trollope's books, which a lot of people will take issue with because some people love Emma by Jane Austen more than the rest of her books. And as I do really enjoy Emma, but I just don't like it as much. I just thought personally it works with my personal opinion on this Trollope book. Um, there's not that much in common except for maybe one clergyman who's ridiculous. That's always the case in both writers' books. There tends to be at least one silly clergyman. Um, and there is at least one attempt at matchmaking in this book. Otherwise, probably not that much in common, but that's okay. My point is that I can really like a writer, I can really like the book, but not as much as their other books. And this is how I felt about He Knew He Was Right. Not because it wasn't a good story, and the secondary characters, the non-main characters, were usually better. And the main characters were the Trevelyan, the couple, because that's the title character. He is Louis Trevelyan. He finds his wife Emily, I think. Yes, Emily. Forgetting names already. He goes off to some islands where her family, her father has been stationed doing some kind of civil work, whatever he does. A high position, but kind of one of those just middle of nowhere situations as well. He finds his wife and takes her and one of her sisters, who is also a big character in this book, back to England and mostly to London. And that sounds almost like a fairy tale situation, especially because once you marry well, it gives more opportunities, as Mrs. Bennet would know, gives more opportunities for the rest of the family to marry well. And Nora is opened to many opportunities, or some opportunities as well. But the problem here lies in this one character, Colonel Osborne, who is a friend of the father. And this all happens within the first chapter or so. So I'm not giving away spoilers, really. He becomes friendly with Mrs. Trevelyan, and it maybe it's harmless, and it definitely is on her part, but there's a little bit of talk. This guy doesn't have the best reputation. He's a flirt. He's this and that, and Trevelyan gets upset and doesn't want his wife to see him anymore. She doesn't take him seriously. She doesn't understand why he's upset, and she doesn't like being kind of ordered. I know you're my husband, but who do you think you are? Basically. So the drama springs from that. And then there's other stories because there's a lot of characters. Nora becomes friendly with one of Trillian's friends, and he has a whole family situation that becomes very important to the plot, regarding an aunt that has money, but she has specific ways of how she wants to distribute that money, and also just she has certain opinions of the way people live their lives. So a lot of the story goes into her situation and her family situation and the place where she lives, the neighbors and their situations. So that actually is the better part of the story, in my opinion. All the other people, and they all are somehow involved in the main character's problems in some way, whether it's directly or indirectly, for the most part. But there's more comedy. There's more just general interest in their stories rather than the Trevelyan's. The Trevelyan, it's such a stubborn situation that you get to the point that you almost just want the book to end just so you could just, okay, what happens? What's going to happen? So I didn't hate it, but I also thought that Trollope is good at sometimes making characters that you just don't feel warm towards. But hey, I love the Barsetshire series more than anything, and I still don't like some of those characters that were more meant to be likable, like Lily Dale, for instance. I always talk about her and how I'm not a fan, but you know, it's not hate, it's just eh. But I still say it's a good book because Trollope so far hasn't gone wrong for me, and I'm almost, and that sounds weird, but I'm almost waiting for the Trollope book that I really, really don't like, and we'll see what happens there. But for now, I would say I wouldn't start. If you're going to start reading Trollope, I wouldn't start with He Knew What He Was Right. I would say once you've gotten maybe 5 books in or so, give it a shot. But yeah, and I think I'm a little more than 5 books in. Yeah, probably closer to 10. Oh, that sounded arrogant. I didn't mean it to. Oh yeah, closer to 10. But I mean, people have read a lot more than that of Anthony Trollope, so I'm really not bragging about anything. But I'm excited because I am really happy to have finished another one of his books and to be moving on to another one. And I started the Belton Estate, which so far so good. I'm not absolutely enthralled with it yet, but so far so good. And you'll hear about that another time. The other fiction book I read was a historical fiction. I tend to say that I don't go as much for World War II fiction as other historical fiction types, and I know it's so popular that maybe, and I'm not disliking something just because it's popular, but I don't prefer it just because it is either, if that makes sense. So but sometimes when it's also books about books, then I mean, so this is the Blackout Book Club by Amy Lynn Green. And yes, of course, you're getting to see the back of a woman, as always, but you also get to see books, so that's pretty cool. I didn't know just from grabbing it, well, I didn't grab it, I heard of it and put it on hold at the library, grabbed it from the library, but I didn't know that this didn't take place in England. For some reason, I saw this and figured it was going to be like a Blitz era story, but actually it's the early 40s. It's when the United States has already gotten involved in World War II, so post Pearl Harbor, etc. I think it's 1942, and it takes place in Maine. Maine. The main event. I haven't actually read a lot of books that take place in Maine. I have never read anything by Stephen King, for instance. I don't think. So let's go for the record here. And and that's a good question. Have any of you read any Stephen King books? Please let me know in the comments if I should ever start. I don't think it's my cup of tea, but you never know. But this, obviously it's called the Blackout Book Club because in those days people were at nighttime blacking out their windows, etc., keeping the lights down. Even though they didn't have to deal with the Blitz per se, Maine was a coastal city and state. I know so little about Maine. I am almost embarrassed. I've never been there. I've always wanted to go, but I've just never been. So I do know that, actually, I know now. What I didn't know back then was that they had to keep vigilant because apparently there were U-boats. The Germans had U-boats and everything. That they were trying to actually um, destroy some of the United States uh, naval artillery or whatever, and they were trying to get spying on the land, and they did to a point. A lot of them got caught up, but so even though a lot of the male characters in the story are shipped out to Europe and Asia, etc., um, there are people who are involved in some, I guess you would call, home front activity as well. There's at least one person who gets sent out to in not really a Coast Guard, but something a little more homespun. And it's interesting because I did learn a little more about World War II activity that I knew nothing about, because I'm a little bit ignorant about that time. Not completely, but just it's not my focus, I guess you would say. Um, and this is why I do say that historical fiction does have its benefits, because it gets you to be a little bit curious about a time, because you say, okay, I'm not really that interested, but now that I see what people were dealing with during the time, I may want to read a little more. Maybe a book, maybe an article, maybe a documentary. It's not reading, but you know what I mean. I want to find out more. And this is very helpful. So I would recommend that just for that, but I wouldn't recommend a book just because of that. I actually started out not sure, because I read the first couple of pages and I had so many other books that I was reading. I was like, okay, this is good. Of course, it's going to be about books too, but am I really interested in this right now? But once I really started going, I said, yeah, this is a really good book, and very readable, if that makes sense. Like readable, like you could just keep going. Um, Even someone like me, who's in the middle of billions of books, got to points where I was charging through. Um, and it's mostly about women who, some of them have moved into this area. Is it called I feel like it's called Long Island. I don't know why, because I know I live technically in off of New York's Long Island. Queens is part of Long Island, right? Anyway, but so they were they're talking about certain areas, but yeah, there are a few women who move to find work in this area, and then there were some people who already live in this area, and one of whom is Avis. I always like that name because it sounds, well, it means bird. But she isn't really that much of a book person, but her brother, who works at this library, is shipped out. So she is asked to take over his position until he comes back. So at first she's a little bit grudging, but there's also a wealthy spinster who, I like the word spinster, I don't care, who it was her father's library, so she can make certain decisions, who's looking to turn the library into a space used for the war effort. And so what happens is that Avis and a few other characters come together to start a book club. So they just talk about different books, and just to keep the library relevant. And so there's a lot of discussion about various different books. Edgar Allan Poe, for instance, P.G. Wodehouse, which I really need to read him again, Shakespeare, Emily Dickinson, and more. I'm not remembering every. There is a reading list at the back of the book. So, and then and the different lives come together. Everybody's got something that they're not talking about, little secrets that they're keeping to themselves. One character is has two kids, and she's just trying to provide for them, but she's also dealing with the difficulty with her husband, and also the fact that she is Italian, and at that time period, being Italian would be not always something pleasant during World War II. So that's an interesting challenge. And one person who's a family had a lobster business, and now their land and their whole living is appropriated by the government, and so they have to deal with that. So there's a number of different stories, and they all meet together, and it's a pretty feel good story. Actually, most of the characters are quite likable, and if this sounds like something that you'd be into, I would really recommend it. It has It's a very it is cheerful though in its own way. It's cozy despite being warish, if that makes sense. Anyway, for like take it from someone who's not that into World War II novels. It's a good book. Anyway, so now I'm going to get into my the two biographies I finished, and both of these are about people who are looked upon negatively usually in English history, and both of which had their negative aspects, but not entirely. The first one, and this is the first book I've been reading, the first book I finished in recent times, but I will be reading more. I am currently reading another book about him, and I have another book that I'm going to read about him, and that is Richard III. And so this is Richard III, England's Most Controversial King by Chris Skidmore. I think this book has other titles that it goes by. I have another book by this writer about the Battle of Bosworth, so I'm sure it covers a very similar time period. It is, a biography about Richard III, and it is, I wouldn't, it's good, but I don't know if I would consider it the definitive book about him. I feel like I don't know if I want my biographer to be firmly on the side of the person that they're writing about, but I feel like he sometimes wanted to explain Richard III a little bit better, and sometimes I feel like he was just giving him all kinds of greedy motives just for the heck of it, and I felt like I didn't really understand if he felt, I don't know, like, not that I wanted it to be written by someone who's a firm Ricarian, who is like, Richard could do no wrong per se, but I didn't feel like he was explaining why he thought Richard did what he did. And even though obviously that is somewhat opinion, conjecture, etc., I feel like with Richard III, you need to be able to put a little more meat into the character, and maybe put a little bit of your opinion in. I believe the author is a politician, so maybe it makes sense that he wasn't really putting a firm opinion down. I don't know if that sounds very negative about politicians, but it was good. And there were details in here that I hadn't read in other books. But I do feel a little better now that I'm reading another book that was written in the 1950s by, yes, the writer does seem a slightly more partial to Richard III. Maybe that's what I want after all. I do think that even though I'm not a firm Richard III Society person, I do think that there's a little part of me that wants him to be the good guy for some reason. Not an angel, but whatever. And I had just watched the movie The Lost King, which is about basically the story behind finding the remains of Richard III, which hadn't been found until 2012, which I still find amazing that in my lifetime it happened. I had already been reading about Richard III and other parts of English history at that point for close to a decade. I'd already had thoughts about him, and so when it happened, it was really significant. And I'm still surprised that I haven't had that many opportunities, but I'm still surprised that I haven't been up to Leicester to see where he is now buried, interred, whatever you want to call it. But I don't know. There's so many things I want to do if I ever get back to England that there's just no time for anything. I still think it was an okay book. I don't think this would be the book I would recommend. I'm still working on which book I would recommend about Richard III. I don't think there is specifically one. Just like almost anybody, there's almost no one book. I do think that one book that I read recently about Catherine Howard by Gareth Russell was probably the best one to recommend, but it's rare that I could do that about almost anyone, even like Elizabeth I. I love reading about her. There's not one book I can recommend. There are some that are closer. But anyway, I'm rambling. Last but not least, I finished Henrietta Maria by Leanda Delisle. I feel like I've read other books by this writer. The name is very familiar. I've seen her on YouTube being interviewed. But you see that it says here, the warrior queen who divided a nation. That's because she married Charles I. And in the beginning, I was like, she's not a warrior queen. But then I did see how she did put herself forward in helping her husband, or trying to help her husband, to defeat the I don't know what they called it back in those days, the Roundheads, Cromwell's forces, etc., Parliament, um, in the English Civil War. And obviously, in the beginning, well, very much so, Charles I did not succeed. He was executed, which was pretty shocking. I think that's the last time that, um, I think that's the last time a king of England was violently deposed. Um, there was one more, James the Second, the Glorious Revolution, which I haven't read a lot about recently. I might want to do that again. Who is also, actually, it was Charles I's son, who was also taken off the throne by his own uh, daughter and nephew. Yes, cousins were married. um, but anyway, but it wasn't as violent. It just wasn't. And but in this case, Henrietta Maria was the daughter of a king of England who had been Protestant, but then he converted to Catholicism. Her mother was a Medici, whatever, and which was interesting because I had just been reading about Catherine de Medici recently, and he had converted to Catholicism, but he still was assassinated, and there was a lot of turmoil in France during this time. Not just religious division, but just different factions, different sides. And of course, like most royal families, the children are married off into all of the different lands. So if there's difficulty, there's usually families that are put against each other. But at some point, Henrietta Maria was married to Charles I. And one of the things that that her family and, the French government was encouraging for her is to try to maybe possibly have her own family brought up as a Catholic family, maybe try to get her husband around that side, and most importantly, to try to not have as much persecution of Catholics, because in England this was a time period where they were really not a fan of Catholicism, and you would get fined for not participating, for instance, in the English the Anglican, whatever you want to call it, Church of England activities. So she could have been a help in that way, but often she was looked at as someone who could turn England into, Mary I's England, and people were very against that. And so I think she's used a little bit as a scapegoat, like somebody who was, plotting all kinds of things, and I don't think that's the case. But this book gets into her life, her lifestyle, and her efforts, and how things went south. And also, I mean, they didn't make her out to be the most successful person ever, although she was helpful in a lot of ways. And she sure was good at giving heirs, I mean, with an H. Probably also the other, a little bit. But there were instances in which she encouraged her husband to do something that would have helped, actually, rather than hurt him and his cause. And he didn't listen. And maybe he should have listened to her. So I don't think that vilifying her is a great idea. Although nowadays it's hard to, it's hard to take sides. It's really hard. But I also think this, if you don't know anything about Henrietta Maria, which a lot of people don't, because a lot of times when we read English history, it focuses a lot on the Tudor time, for instance, and not so much on what happened afterwards. But I would recommend it. It's a good, rounded biography of her life and also that time period. So I think it was a pretty successful reading period for me. And let me know if you've read any of these books, what you think about them, if there's any of these books you'd like to read. Or if there's books similar to this that you'd like to recommend. I'm always happy to hear suggestions. If you are new to this channel and you are interested in these type of books and talking about them, please feel free to subscribe, and maybe I will actually get a sentence out. Blah, blah, blah. And that is all for now. I am very much caffeinated today. This is Catherine at Taking Tea with Catherine. Have a lovely tea and book-filled day.